The rain poured heavily outside the small diner, creating a soft rhythm against the glass windows. The night was cold, and most of the customers had already left. Emma wiped the counter, her tired eyes glancing at the clock. Just one more hour until her shift ended. She sighed and looked around. The place was almost empty, except for an old man sitting in the corner, slowly sipping his coffee. Just as she turned to put away the last of the dishes, a small bell above the door rang. A tall man stepped inside. His dark coat dripped with rain, and his expensive shoes left wet marks on the floor. His face was partly hidden under a hood, but Emma could see his strong jawline and tired eyes. He looked lost, like someone who had wandered in without knowing why. Emma straightened up. "Good evening. Take a seat anywhere," she said with a polite smile. The man hesitated, then walked toward the counter and sat on a stool. He didn't take off his coat, didn't shake off the rain. He just sat there, staring at the menu without really reading it. Emma grabbed her notepad. "What can I get you?" The man didn't answer immediately. After a long silence, he finally said, "Just coffee." His voice was deep but filled with something else, pain. Emma nodded and poured him a fresh cup. The strong aroma filled the air, but the man only wrapped his hands around the cup. He didn't drink. Minutes passed. Emma stole a glance at him. There was something about him that made her uneasy, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that made her curious. He wasn't just another customer. He was different. Finally, she couldn't hold back. "Rough night?" she asked, keeping her voice light. The man let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "You could say that." Emma leaned on the counter. "Talking helps, or at least that's what people say." He lifted his eyes to hers for the first time. They were deep-haunted and held a story she couldn't understand. "Do you believe broken people can be fixed?" he asked suddenly. Emma blinked, caught off guard. She had heard a lot of strange things working late-night shifts, but this was different. She hesitated, then answered honestly. "I think everyone can heal, but sometimes they need the right person to help them." The man studied her, his fingers tightening around the cup. The rain outside grew heavier, the wind howling against the windows. After a long silence, he spoke again. "I lost something. Someone." His voice cracked slightly. Emma felt a strange pull in her heart. She didn't know this man, but in that moment, she saw him as pain, raw and real. "I'm sorry," she said softly. The man took a deep breath and looked down at his coffee. "You remind me of someone I failed to save." Emma's breath caught. She wanted to ask more, but something in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't ready. The diner felt quieter than before. The only sounds were the rain outside and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Emma had served hundreds of customers over the years, but something told her this man was about to change her life in a way she never expected. And she had no idea what was coming next. The diner was silent except for the occasional clatter of dishes in the kitchen and the steady hum of the rain outside. Emma watched the man in front of her, sensing the weight of something heavy in his heart. He had barely touched his coffee, just staring into the dark liquid, as if searching for answers. For a moment, she wondered if she should say something. But before she could, he spoke again. "I used to think money could solve everything," he said, his voice quiet, almost as if he was talking to himself. "But I was wrong." Emma leaned slightly closer. "Money helps, but it can't fix everything," she said gently. A small, sad smile appeared on his lips. "That's what she used to say, too." Emma frowned. "She?" The man exhaled deeply, running a hand through his damp hair. He looked like someone debating whether to speak or keep his pain locked inside. Finally, he looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. "My name is Daniel," he said, "Daniel Carter." Emma froze for a second. That name? It sounded familiar. Her brows furrowed as she tried to place it. And then it hit her. Daniel Carter, the billionaire. The one always in the news, the man who built an empire from nothing. She had seen his face in magazines, always looking powerful, always surrounded by success. But the man sitting in front of her didn't look powerful at all. He looked lost. "You're the Daniel Carter?" she asked carefully. He gave a small nod, his fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup. "That's what people call me. But that's not who I am anymore." Emma studied him, unsure of what to say. A billionaire sitting in a small diner at midnight, looking like he had nowhere else to go. It didn't make sense. "Why are you here?" she finally asked. Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. "Because everywhere else feels empty." Something about his words made Emma's heart squeeze. She had felt that emptiness before, after her husband walked out, after she was left alone to raise her son. She hesitated before asking what happened to her. Daniel's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into a fist, knuckles turning white. "She was everything good in my life," he said after a long pause, and I let her slip away. The pain in his voice was raw, like an old wound that had never healed. Emma didn't push in for more, but she could feel it. There was more to his story, more than he was willing to say. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle. The old man in the corner had left. Now, it was just the two of them, sitting in a quiet diner in the middle of the night, surrounded by secrets and regrets. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel wasn't completely alone. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, her mind still replaying Daniel's words. She had seen rich men before, arrogant, confident, always in control. But Daniel Carter was different. He wasn't just wealthy, he was broken. The billionaire sat in front of her, staring at his untouched coffee. His eyes held years of pain, and Emma could feel the weight of it in every word he spoke. For a while, there was silence between them. Then, Daniel looked up. "You're different," he said suddenly. Emma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly. "Most people either want something from me, or they're too scared to talk to me." His gaze softened. "But you're just here, listening." Emma shrugged. "You're a person, just like everyone else." Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "I haven't felt like a person in a long time." He took a deep breath, then looked straight into her eyes. "Come work for me." Emma blinked, caught completely off guard. "What?" "I don't mean as a waitress," Daniel said quickly. "I don't need another employee. I need someone who understands pain." His voice was quiet but firm. "I need someone like you." Emma laughed nervously. "You want to hire me too?" "What? Talk to you?" Daniel didn't smile. "Something like that." Emma stared at him, trying to understand. "I don't get it. You could talk to a therapist." "I don't need a therapist," he said. "I need someone real. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth." Emma hesitated. The offer sounded ridiculous. A billionaire hiring a single mom just to keep him company. It didn't make sense. She shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but I have a son, a life. I can't just." "I know," Daniel interrupted. "And I'm not asking you to leave your life. I need someone who isn't pretending." He leaned forward slightly. "You said broken people can heal. Help me prove that's true." Emma's heart pounded. This was insane. Completely insane. And yet, as she looked at the man in front of her, she couldn't ignore the truth. He was drowning, and for some reason, he had reached for her hand. She swallowed hard. "I don't even know you." Daniel nodded. "Then, let's change that." For the first time, Emma saw something in his eyes that wasn't pain. It was hope, small, fragile, but real. And against all logic, she found herself considering his offer. Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove up the long, winding road. The farther she went, the darker the surroundings became. Towering trees lined both sides, their branches swaying in the cold evening breeze. The road felt endless, leading her deeper into a world she didn't belong to. Then, finally, she saw it. A massive iron gate stood before her, tall and imposing. Beyond it, a mansion loomed in the distance, its towering structure barely visible under the dim glow of the outdoor lights. The place looked less like a home and more like a forgotten castle, grand yet empty. Emma's heart pounded as the gate slowly creaked open. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to come, but something about Daniel Carter made it impossible to walk away. She drove through the entrance and parked near the front door. As she stepped out of the car, the cold air bit at her skin. The mansion's doors opened before she could even knock. Daniel stood there, dressed in black, his face unreadable. "You came," he said quietly. Emma forced a small smile. "I said I'd think about it. I guess I'm still thinking." Daniel nodded and stepped aside, letting her in. The moment she entered, a strange feeling washed over her. The air inside was heavy, filled with something unspoken. The mansion was breathtaking, high ceilings, marble floors, and grand chandeliers. But it didn't feel like a home. It felt abandoned. Emma glanced around. "You live here alone?" Daniel walked ahead without answering. She followed him through a long hallway, passing several closed doors. At the end of the hall, he stopped in front of one door, resting his hand on the handle. "This room holds my past," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One day, I'll open it." Emma's eyes flickered to the door. It looked like any other door in the house, but something about the way Daniel spoke made it feel different. She wanted to ask what was inside, but before she could, Daniel turned away. "Come, I'll show you where you'll be staying." Emma hesitated but followed. As they walked deeper into the mansion, one thought wouldn't leave her mind. What was behind that door? And more importantly, why was Daniel so afraid to open it? The wind howled outside, rattling the tall windows of the mansion. Inside, the fire crackled in the grand fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. Emma sat on the couch, watching Daniel as he stared into the flames, lost in thought. Days had passed since she started coming to the mansion, yet Daniel remained a mystery. He spoke little about his past, always changing the topic when she asked. But tonight felt different. There was something in his eyes, something heavier than usual. Emma broke the silence. "You said this house holds your past, but you never talk about it." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Because some pasts are better left untouched." Emma shook her head. "Pain doesn't go away just because you ignore it, Daniel." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn-out photograph. He hesitated before handing it to her. Emma took it carefully. The edges were slightly torn, and the colors had faded with time. It was a picture of Daniel, younger, happier, standing beside a beautiful woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. Emma traced her finger over the woman's face. "She was important to you." Daniel swallowed hard. "She was my wife." Emma's heart clenched. She looked up at him. What happened to her? Daniel's jaw tightened. He seemed to struggle with the words before finally whispering, "She was everything good in my life, and I let her slip away." Emma placed the photo down gently. "How?" Daniel's eyes darkened. He turned toward the fire, his expression unreadable. "Because of me," he said. "Because I was too blind to see what really mattered." A heavy silence filled the room. Emma went to ask more, but something in his voice stopped her. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't just grief, this was guilt. But what had Daniel done? And why did he believe he was the reason for his wife's death? Emma wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the truth. But she knew one thing for certain. Tonight, everything had changed. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the cold, empty mansion. Emma sat still, holding her breath, waiting for Daniel to continue. His hands were clenched into fists, his gaze locked on the dancing flames. For days, she had sensed the weight he carried, the guilt, the regret. But now, it was right in front of her, raw and exposed. Finally, he spoke. "She was sick," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I didn't see it." Emma frowned. "Sick." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "Cancer." His voice broke on the word. She knew, but she didn't tell me. Not at first. And when she did, I was too busy to listen. Emma's heart ached. "You didn't know," she said gently. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "I should have. She tried to tell me. She begged me to slow down, to stay home more. But I was too focused on my company. I thought I was building a future for us. I thought there would always be time." His voice grew hoarse. By the time I realized, it was too late. She was already slipping away. He looked down at his hands as if he could still feel her touch. She died alone. Emma's throat tightened. "Daniel, you can't blame yourself for." He shook his head sharply. "I wasn't there when she needed me. I wasn't there when she was scared. And I wasn't there when she took her last breath." Tears burned in Emma's eyes. She wanted to reach for him, to tell him he wasn't a monster. But before she could speak, he whispered something that made her blood run cold. "I don't deserve to be forgiven." Emma froze. There was something final in his tone, something that made her heart race. Daniel turned to her, his eyes empty. "That's why I gave away everything. The company, the cars, the houses. None of it means anything anymore." Emma shook her head. "You can't live like this." Daniel gave a small, sad smile. "I'm not living, Emma. I've just been waiting." Emma's stomach twisted. Waiting for what? But deep down, she already knew the answer. And she had never been more afraid. The room felt colder than before, despite the fire still burning in the fireplace. Emma sat frozen, her heart pounding. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "I'm not living, Emma. I've just been waiting." A heavy silence stretched between them. She could see it in his eyes. He had given up. Emma took a shaky breath. "Waiting for what, Daniel?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. And then, with haunting calmness, he said the words that sent a chill down her spine. "For it all to end." Emma's stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I've spent years punishing myself, carrying this guilt. But the truth is, I don't deserve to keep going." His voice was quiet but firm. "I don't deserve a second chance." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "That's not true." Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. "You don't understand, Emma. My wife didn't just die. She died believing I didn't love her enough to stay." His voice cracked, and she was right. Emma's chest ached. She couldn't let him believe that. She wouldn't want this for you. Daniel exhaled sharply. She's gone, Emma. What I want doesn't matter anymore. Emma felt panic rising in her chest. He wasn't just grieving. He was ready to give up completely. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. Daniel, listen to me. You don't get to decide that your life is over just because you made mistakes. You think you don't deserve a second chance. She paused, her voice steady. Then prove yourself wrong. Daniel blinked as if caught off guard by her words. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. You're still here, Daniel. That means there's still time. For the first time, his mask cracked. His fingers trembled under hers. A war raged behind his eyes, between the guilt that had consumed him for years and the hope he was too afraid to believe in. And then, just when Emma thought he would pull away, Daniel whispered, Do you really think I can be saved? Emma's grip tightened. I know he can. The mansion remained silent, the storm outside finally fading. But inside that room, something had changed. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter wasn't waiting for the end. He was waiting for a reason to begin again.